This is Unit 3, and in this unit we're going to be talking about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Now I want to remind you now that you need to be taking notes. That is your homework, and then when you get to class we'll go over your notes and make sure that you have everything that you need for the test and for the formative assessments. I would also like to mention that this unit, I'm going to try to break it down into sections so that you're not overloaded with information. So if you'd like to stop at the end of each section, I will make a note of that in this presentation, and you can just write down the minute and the time where you stopped and pick up tomorrow. This unit covers competencies 2F and 2G. Those include ATP, respiration, and photosynthesis. What those competencies mean is that you will be able to identify the structure and function of ATP molecules, and you'll be able to analyze and connect the roles of reactants and products in photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Energy is required by organisms to maintain homeostasis, which just means everything's balanced inside and outside of the organism. In this case, we're talking specifically about cells. And energy is also required to carry out cellular metabolism. Metabolism just means those are the chemical processes that occur within an organism to maintain life. In this case, to maintain homeostasis and to continue doing the job that that cell is created for. The type of energy that cells use is ATP. You can see at the bottom there is a structure of that ATP molecule, and we'll talk more about what that means in just a few minutes. But this is one of the pictures that is going to be on your test, so it's important that you also note this structure. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. Now, adenosine triphosphate is a nucleic acid, which is one of the organic molecules that we talked about in Unit 1. So the structure of a nucleic acid in general is a 5-carbon sugar, a nitrogen base, and a phosphate group. DNA is one of the other nucleic acids that we've talked about. ATP is made of ribose, the nitrogen base, and 3 phosphate groups. So in this case, we have the 5-carbon sugar ribose, which you can see down there in the pink. Then we have adenine, which is the nitrogen base, and 3 phosphate groups. So adenosine triphosphate means 3 phosphate groups. ATP is the equivalent of energy. ATP is made in the mitochondria, and remember from the last unit, mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. So the powerhouse of the cell, the mitochondria, makes energy in the form of ATP. It's going to take sugars that are ingested or made by the organism, and it's going to turn those sugars into ATP. Energy is created when the bond between the 2nd and 3rd phosphate group is broken. When the bond is broken and the energy is released, the molecule becomes ADP. The ADP travels back to the mitochondria, and cellular respiration adds the phosphate group back and turns it back into an ATP molecule. You can see from that picture in the top right-hand corner, that is the ADP-ATP cycle. So at the top we start with ATP, that would have the 3 phosphate groups. Then it's going to go through the process of releasing that energy. So the phosphate group's going to break off, energy is released for the cell to do work, and then once that phosphate is released, it then becomes ADP. Diphosphate means 2. Goes back to the mitochondria, and then the phosphate group is added back and it becomes ATP again. When we're talking about breaking the bonds of ATP, there are 2 requirements. Enzymes, which are proteins, another organic molecule that we talked about, and then water is also a requirement. So water and enzymes break that ATP bond and release the energy. So it releases a little burst of energy when that phosphate group breaks off. That picture at the bottom makes the analogy that ATP is like a charged battery. So when those 3 phosphates are there, it's storing potential energy. When the phosphate breaks off, then that ADP is like an uncharged battery. So the battery's got to go back through the power cycle of the mitochondria to get recharged again. The two types of organisms that we're going to be discussing are autotrophs and heterotrophs. Now, those are vocabulary words and you need to know what they mean. Autotrophs carry out photosynthesis and respiration. Autotrophs make their own food. For the purposes of this discussion, this will be plants that we'll talk about. Heterotrophs carry out respiration only. Heterotrophs have to consume other organisms in order to get the sugars that they need. So if you look at the bottom, we have the flower. That's going to be an autotroph. It carries out photosynthesis by taking sunlight and turning it into sugar. The heterotrophs would be the chipmunk, the seal, and the shark. They have to consume other organisms in order to get the sugar that they have ingested to carry out cellular respiration. And that is very important to know. Autotrophs, photosynthesis and respiration. Heterotrophs, respiration only. We'll also be talking about chemical reactions. Chemical reactions occur within cells for metabolic processes. So everything that needs to happen within that cell can be written out as a chemical formula or a chemical equation. When we're looking at these equations, you need to know what the reactants are and what the products are. Reactants go into the reaction. Products are produced. So when we're looking at all of these different reactions, remember that matter is neither created nor destroyed, but the compounds or those elements can recombine to form new substances. So what goes in must come out. That goes back to balancing chemical equations, and I'm not sure how much of that you did last year, but when you take chemistry, that's heavy on balancing those equations, and we'll look at that some more in detail. Most of the life processes that occur within animals or plants can be broken down into those chemical reactions, and you do need to know those for the purposes of this unit. That's all we need to know about ATP and ADP. So if you'd like to stop here with your notes, you can go ahead and do that and then pick back up where you left off tomorrow. Now we're going to discuss photosynthesis. The reactants of photosynthesis are carbon dioxide and water. Remember, that's what goes into the reaction. The products of photosynthesis are glucose, which is a type of sugar, oxygen, and water. Radiant energy, which is also sunlight, and chlorophyll must be present for this reaction to occur. So if you look at the equation at the bottom, this is not the exact equation that I want you to write down, but just so we get a look at what's going in and what's coming out, this is useful. The reason that I don't want you to write down this equation is because this equation takes into account transpiration, which we will discuss when we get to the plants unit. It should be 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O. That's the way it's always referred to on the test. So for the purposes of your photosynthesis equation, don't write this down, but we can at least take a look at it. So this equation is balanced, and we'll talk more about balancing equations in class. We have 6 CO2 molecules, that's carbon dioxide, plus the water in the presence of light and chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is the plant enzyme. Yields, that's what the arrow means, C6H12O6, which is the glucose, and then oxygen and water is also given off. Photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplast. That is the cell organelle. We discussed that in the last unit. Chlorophyll is the green pigment that's found in the chloroplast. So the chlorophyll has to be present in order to capture the sunlight. The chloroplast captures light and converts it into chemical bonds that can be used by autotrophs for food. Autotrophs capture light energy and turn it into sugar. So we have, remember going in, we have carbon dioxide and water. Then with the chlorophyll and sunlight, that carbon dioxide and water is turned into sugar and oxygen. The internal structure of the chloroplast is at the bottom. Thylakoids are found in stacks in the middle of the chloroplast, and then there's a fluid surrounding the thylakoids. That's called the stroma. There are two parts of making sugar for photosynthesis. We have the light-dependent reactions and the light-independent reactions, which is also called the Calvin cycle. So the light-dependent reactions occur in the thylakoids. The thylakoids are where the chlorophyll is, so that chlorophyll captures the sunlight in the thylakoids, and then we have carrier molecules that go out to the stroma to carry out the Calvin cycle. I would like you to know the two parts of the reaction, but we don't necessarily need to know all the details of the specifics of those reactions. So know that the light-dependent reaction happens first in the thylakoid, then the Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma. Now, if you'd like to stop your notes there, that was the end of the photosynthesis section. If you want to keep going, keep going. So next up we have respiration. Cellular respiration occurs in the mitochondria. You should recognize that structure from our last unit. Respiration is the process of converting food energy or sugars into a usable form. All living things carry out respiration, autotrophs and heterotrophs. So remember, autotrophs carry out photosynthesis and respiration. Autotrophs and heterotrophs carry out cellular respiration. The mitochondria is a very specific organelle, and it has a very specific structure that allows it to carry out those processes that it needs to do in order to make energy for cellular metabolism. So the inner folds, all that squiggly stuff in the middle in that picture, is called the cristae. The folds increase the surface area. So it's kind of like your intestines are all folded in your stomach. It kind of works the same way. So to maximize the small amount of space that is available, those folds allow for more contact when the Krebs cycle occurs, and we'll talk more about that. These are your chemical equations that I want you to write down for photosynthesis and respiration. So you can see photosynthesis is on the left. This is the equation that you need to know. So we have 6 CO2, carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of it, plus 6 H2O, 6 molecules of water. The arrow means yields. C6H12O6, which is the glucose, plus 6 O2, 6 molecules of oxygen. Now remember, photosynthesis has to occur in the presence of sunlight and chlorophyll. So sometimes you'll see that written on the bottom or the top of that arrow. Then take a look at the equation for cellular respiration. You also need to write this down. 6O2, 6 molecules of oxygen, plus C6H12O6, glucose, yields 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O plus energy. That energy would be the ATP. So looking at those equations, you can see that they're opposite processes. The products of photosynthesis are what go into the reaction of cellular respiration. And then what comes out of respiration goes into photosynthesis. So you can see the connection between the chloroplasts and the mitochondria. So that cycle is very dependent. One is very dependent on the other. Again, the reactants of respiration are the products of photosynthesis, and then vice versa, the products of respiration are the reactants of photosynthesis. So you can see that cycle there that's shown in the picture at the bottom. The plant produces oxygen, the animal takes in the oxygen, the animal breaks down sugars from the plants, animal releases carbon dioxide, plant takes in carbon dioxide, plant uses the carbon to make sugar. Oxygen is a reactant of cellular respiration, so oxygen must be present for respiration to occur. Respiration does not refer to breathing, but for the purposes of this unit, you can make that connection. So respiration is breathing. You inhale oxygen and you exhale carbon dioxide. Those are both products and reactants of the process. Aerobic means oxygen. Some organisms, including animals and humans, may not have a ready supply of oxygen, in which case fermentation is what will occur. So anaerobic means no oxygen. So when oxygen is not present, that's where fermentation will come in. I am going to have to print this chart off because obviously it did not translate into Keynote, but I will have copies of that ready for you when you come to class, and we'll go over it. So these are the overall steps of aerobic cellular respiration. You do need to know those definitions, by the way, aerobic and anaerobic. So the first step of respiration is glycolysis. And you can see from that chart on the left, I've got glycolysis circled. So glycolysis is anaerobic. Now, in the overall process of cellular respiration, glycolysis is the first step. But glycolysis does not require oxygen. So glycolysis is anaerobic. It occurs in the cytoplasm. One molecule of glucose, which is that C6H12O6, is broken down into two molecules of pyruvic acid. So the process uses two molecules of ATP to get started. It generates 4 molecules of ATP. So we have a net creation of 2 ATP molecules. Next, we have the Krebs cycle. So we're moving from the cytoplasm, and now we're going into the mitochondria. So the second step is the Krebs cycle, which is also referred to sometimes as the citric acid cycle. So make sure that you know both of those terms. This part is aerobic. Pyruvic acid, those 2 molecules created by glycolysis, go into the mitochondria, and it goes through 2 cycles. So each of those molecules has to go through a full cycle in the Krebs cycle in order to produce the ATP. So it goes through 2 cycles and creates 4 ATP molecules. Carbon dioxide is also a byproduct. So carbon dioxide is created in this part of the cycle. Then we have step 3, which is the electron transport chain. Also an aerobic process. This also occurs in the mitochondria, and it creates a total of 32 ATP, which is the most of the entire cycle of cellular respiration. You need to know that. So what happens in the electron transport chain is these high energy electrons get transferred by carrier molecules, and those are what creates this huge batch of ATP molecules. In this step of the process, water is a byproduct. So we have oxygen created in the Krebs cycle, and then we have water that's given off during the ETC. If you want to stop your notes there, you may. This next section is going to talk about fermentation. Fermentation is anaerobic. So when there's no oxygen present to carry out cellular respiration, fermentation will occur. So fermentation is another process that can release the ATP from food molecules. There are 2 types, alcoholic and lactic acid fermentation. So you can see the picture on the bottom. On the left, we have alcoholic fermentation. So first glycolysis takes place, which occurs in the cytoplasm. And then if fermentation occurs, it's also going to take place in the cytoplasm. So remember, oxygen is going to cover those processes that happen in the mitochondria, but if it doesn't need oxygen, it can take place in the cytoplasm. On the left, we have alcoholic fermentation, so you can see that process all mapped out. And then on the right is lactic acid fermentation. Those carrier molecules that we talked about in that last section for cellular respiration, that is where those NAD and NADH molecules come in. And you can see there are some ions in that process. That's because they are either taking on electrons or they're releasing them to become ions. So here we'll compare the 2 types of fermentation. On the left, you can see lactic acid fermentation occurs in animals, including humans. It produces lactic acid and a total of 2 ATP molecules. So it's not really efficient to carry out fermentation. It's much more efficient to carry out cellular respiration, but desperate times call for desperate measures, and if oxygen's not available, the cell still needs energy to keep going. Lactic acid fermentation is usually produced during exercise. So if you are running and your respiration, your breathing increases, the cell's going to struggle because it's not getting enough oxygen. So in order to keep going, fermentation is going to start and lactic acid is produced. Lactic acid is what makes your muscles sore after you've exercised a lot, because the buildup of that acid has to eventually be excreted and go to your liver. Then on the right, we have alcoholic fermentation. Alcoholic fermentation occurs in plants. It produces carbon dioxide, alcohol, and 2 ATP. So this is the type of fermentation that's used to make alcohol, beer, wine, those kinds of things. It's also used by yeast, and it makes bread rise, those types of things.